This conference is now being recorded.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the New York State ASBO webinar, Basic Budgeting. My name is Matthew Darius. I'm the Senior Staff Associate for Professional Development here at ASBO, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Your speaker for today's program is Michael Sanangelo. Operator assistance is available anytime during this conference by pressing £0. You may send chat questions anytime during the presentation using the chat window indicated by a speech bubble icon located to the right of the presentation. I will now turn the call over to our speaker. Mike, please begin.
Thank you, Matthew, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this part of the Budgeting and Financial Planning Workshop webinar. We have done part 2, 3, and 4, and we are now doing part 1, which was postponed from an earlier time period. So this is the first part, but also the final part, the last in the series to be presented in this Budgeting and Financial Planning webinar. Let's begin by just looking at what has become, I think, somewhat symbolic of what we've covered in the webinar, and that is the budgeting aspect, but also the budgeting aspect which is fed by certain other aspects of school finance. And we have looked at some of these, at all of these. The strategic plan we've talked about, and we've seen how the aspects of strategic planning certainly go hand in hand with budgeting. We will take a look again at some of that. We also looked at the long-term plan and found how certain aspects of that also feed in to our annual budgeting process. And along the same lines, we looked at the capital plan and technology plans and saw that those aspects also must be considered to put together our school budget. And so we have all of this information that we are accumulating at budget time that feeds into the budget that goes out to the public and is voted upon. And so we need to begin by looking at, beginning with a foundation, if you will, of why we do budgeting, some aspects of budgeting before we get into some of the details. The GASB, the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, has this codification of governmental accounting and financial reporting standards, and it just goes on to define what a budget is and the need for a budget in all governmental units. Of course, schools are part of that. And it talks about the accounting system and common terminology. And throughout, if you've been following or been involved in this series, then you know that we've talked about many aspects of this and looked at some terminology and the accounting system, again, as to how it feeds into our annual school budget. The GASB has also, along with that, talked about some of the importance of financial planning and control, and it just sets the framework and the foundation, I believe, as to why we do budgeting in school districts. And so they have here, it's an estimated financial plan. There are other definitions. We'll look at a couple more as we go forward. But you can tell, and you probably know already, that we're looking at some sort of an estimated financial plan of schools for the following school year. Now, I have shown this before, and I want to emphasize again that the National Advisory Council on State and Local Budgeting has put out this brochure, this pamphlet, which is readily available out on the Government Finance Officers Association website. It's there. It's free. I would encourage you to look at it and be familiar with it. At times, it will provide you with information that you may find useful in your presentations to the Board of Education and to the public. It sets the stage again for why we do budgeting and some of the great aspects or good aspects, best practices as to why we do certain things. It begins with, it goes by principles, and there are 4 basic principles and elements and practices within that. And I'm not going to go through and read all this, but I do want you to see the basic principles. And again, this will be there for your use, and hopefully you'll go back and review it, and then get into the website and look in more detail at what these practices are. But again, it begins with establishing broad goals. Obviously, and we've talked about this throughout the webinar series, that we need to identify certain concerns and priorities, and we can do this through a process of strategic planning. Then we need to look at what we have called SWOT, which was strength, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to our organization, and try to assess what those opportunities may be and also what the threats may be. And then we go on to develop and establish the broad goals. Again, all of this can be part of a planning, strategic planning process, and will help you to identify your school budget. And then we need to try to develop some approaches to how we're going to meet the goals. And if you look through here, I think you'll find some useful information to use in your presentations or in your conversations in explaining the school budget and why you're doing certain things. It goes on to talk about developing programmatic and operating and capital plans, which we have talked about previously, and also developing the strategies and how you're going to go forward in completing some of the goals that you've established for your school district. And then how do you develop the budget that is consistent with these goals? As we've talked about and will emphasize again today, is that a budget is a financial plan that should be based on some sort of other educational plan, and we should do the educational plan first and then base our budget on that. And so this pamphlet, this brochure goes through. It gives you some best practices for doing that, for meeting the goals with the financial plan. It looks at the financial options that are available. Again, this is written for governmental entities. Not everything would be applicable to your school district, but because it's all-encompassing for all governmental units. But you can certainly pick and choose and pick out certain aspects here that I think will be helpful for you. And then the element 10 talks about adopting the school budget and some of the practices that are considered best practices by the Government Finance Officers Association, again, that hopefully would be helpful to you in explaining your school budget. The last principle is evaluating, and we've talked about this before, and again in this series, but it's not enough to just establish the budget and the plan, but you need to go forward and monitor that. And we did look and took a whole section on that as far as monitoring, measuring, and evaluating the performance of the school budget. And then the need to obviously make adjustments because the school budget is a plan, and again, things can change fairly rapidly, as we know, in school districts. So this is the basis, the framework, if you will, for going forward to look at aspects of the school budget in particular. Again, I encourage you to take a closer look at this as time permits. Now, why do we need a policy? Well, these are some of the aspects that you can find on the state education website that talks about the need for education policy. And again, it talks about effective budgeting process. The point here, the main point, is there needs to be a policy. And the Board of Education needs to develop that, of course, in conjunction with the superintendent and you as a school business official. You certainly need to provide the input But it goes on to explain here that as it refers to it, the rewards for the formation of a budget policy statement, adequate control of the financial plan, consistency in the budgetary process from budget to budget. It fixes responsibility and then the assurance that financial commitments do not exceed the appropriations. We'll look at these in a little more detail, but I wanted to give you, again, upfront flavor as to where we're headed and some of the discussion that we're going to have around this need for policy. As we, in this slide I had up before in another presentation, but we also want to make the distinction between policy and regulation. The Board of Education is charged with the responsibility of developing policy, and it then is up to the administrators to take that policy and create a regulation or a more specific practice, if you will. So you need to start with the board developing the policy, and again, you have to help in that endeavor, of course, and then go on to provide the day-to-day operations of the administrative regulations and procedures that are consistent with the policy. So you need both. You need to look at a budgeting policy and then a more specific budgeting practice or regulation, administrative regulation, if you will. Sometimes it's people forget, but just to clarify so that you have this information in case it should come up, the Board of Education is responsible for the preparation and presentation of the budget. It is the board's budget. Now, the board obviously can't do it in isolation or by itself, so it certainly depends on the chief school officer, the superintendent, to provide the initiative and the supervising and the coordinating of the budgeting process. And the chief school officer is usually charged with that responsibility. Again, he or she can't do that by themselves, so they need your assistance, and I would submit that what we should be doing as school business officials is incorporating everybody or lots of people into the budgeting process. And that way, I believe that the end result will be much better. So this talks about the responsibility for preparation. It may at times, as a school business official, feel like you are the person doing most of the work, and that may be the case. But again, the responsibility for it is delineated in the regulation and law among the Board of Education, the superintendent, and then the other professionals in the school district. Of course, that would be the school business official. The format that the budget must be presented in is regulated by the education law, and we are going to look at that. Again, the format that we use for presentation of the budget, the three-part format that we'll look at, is not what we use to manage the finances of the school district. It really wouldn't be in a format that would be conducive to that, although there are some school business administrators that kind of look at this as they are managing the school budget. But really, the regulation here requires a certain format for presentation of the budget only. It doesn't say that the format has to be used for managing the school district. Now, this just continues our conversation about the responsibility. Again, I wanted to make sure that you had everything that I found out there or that I've come across over the years, and so this just hopefully highlights some of the aspects of the board's responsibility, but it does get into this format idea in the second bullet when it talks about the three components. And there is a program component, capital component, and the administrative component. And so it is the task of the school district to take the line line item budget, which most school districts are using, and convert that to the three-part format. And the State Education Department, as we'll see, has given us some guidance in how to do that, or some help in doing that. So we'll see how that occurs in just a few slides from now. The budget must be written in plain language. I don't know that there's really a definition of plain language, except that as with most writing that schools do, we recognize that our audience, our stakeholders, are at various levels of comprehending, writing, and reading, and so we need to be cognizant of that, and we need to make sure that our presentations are such that it is easily understood and written in a way that is not complex, that leads or promotes comprehension, and you always want to make sure everything that you do in the school leads to comprehension and readability for your stakeholders. There is another requirement, and again, we'll get into more detail on this, but the compensation of the superintendent, assistant superintendent, and any administrator who earns over $118,000. Now, that was the number used for the 2010-11 school year. I'm not aware that the new number, if it changes, is out there yet. Typically, it comes later in the budget process after the first of the new year. So that's why I've highlighted it so that you won't forget that is the number that was used currently, but it could very well change. And then on the last bullet, it talks about the annual report card, the educational report card that shows the performance of the school district must also be a part of the information that the Board of Education is responsible for giving to the stakeholders. And then we talk about the availability of the school budget. The school budget must be available upon request. You have to put together what is known as the budget statement. Sometimes it's referred to as the popular budget, popular in the sense of populace, or available for the general population. You must put that together and have it available for the public. It doesn't have to be mailed. It doesn't have to be distributed. It has to be available. You have to have it available upon request. And there should be copies in each one of your school buildings, and it should also obviously be in your district clerk's office and in your office as a school business official. And you need to make sure that you have that document. We'll look at some of the requirements and details that go into making that up. But again, it needs to be in your buildings. And it also goes on to talk about not only do you need this document referred to as budget statement or the budget, but you also need to mail a school budget notice. And we'll look at what that is, what it looks like. You can do that as a separate mailing. You can mail the school budget notice, or some districts, many districts, incorporate that mailing with their school budget brochure. Again, a school budget brochure is a very effective marketing tool for your school budget. However, it is not a requirement. The school budget notice is a requirement. You have to mail that document out. But the brochure is not. But most districts do the brochure. It is, again, a great marketing tool, and incorporate this budget notice as part of the brochure so that there's one mailing with many, many details in it. The final approval of the budget rests with the board. City schools will base their approved budget upon education law 2516, 2519. Small city schools used to have a different law, but it's all the same law at this point for small cities and suburban suburban centralized schools. Obviously, the Big Five have a different approval process, but again, it's the Board of Education's responsibility to adopt that budget and get it out to the voters. Now, there's a legal process that's involved about posting and a legal notice, the public hearing that is coming up, and also the notice of the upcoming budget election, the annual meeting as it is sometimes called, which now has to occur the third Tuesday in May, statewide in every school district. And it goes on to talk about the publishing time frame 4 times within 7 weeks preceding the district meeting. The first publication at least 45 days before said meeting. I have a slide a little bit later which I hopefully have summarized some of this that makes it a little easier to read and find. But this is the actual regulation taken from the State Education Department website. So I wanted you to see that before you saw how I abbreviated it. And it goes on to talk about that the places, the locations of the vote must also be listed in that, in that notice that goes in the legal notices in the newspaper. The proposed budget must be presented to the voters of the district at the annual budget hearing. The voters will approve the budget by majority vote of those present. So it's not majority necessarily of those registered to vote. It's majority vote of those present. And again, it has now, it must be on the third Tuesday in May. The Board of Education may submit its budget and propositions to the voters no more than 2 times. If the voters fail to approve the budget, then it can go for a second submission, or the board can adopt a contingency budget. If it fails 2 times, the board must adopt the contingency budget. I will have more on contingency as we go through this webinar. I have a few more slides on that for you. If you look at the suggested content, and you want to probably check your Board of Education handbooks, or if you have it on the CD-ROM at this point, but you need to have a budgeting policy. It's very important to have that. I would submit again to you that it's not only good for the district and the board to have this, but it works well for the school business official to have all of this documented and laid out for you. Since you are a major player in this school budgeting process, you certainly want to have something at your disposal which spells out what the governing board has asked of you and the superintendent. So I would encourage you that if for any reason parts of the policy manual that you have is lacking in any one of these areas, that you encourage whoever you need to, the superintendent probably, to adjust, to modify so that all of these aspects are incorporated. And again, you can go on the State Education Department website and you can certainly find information on this policy booklet that they suggest and more detail as far as what to incorporate in your policy. So I encourage you to do that. The budget triangle is, again, a triangle that's been used out there in textbooks and by researchers. And what it says and emphasizes, again, what we've emphasized in this webinar in the past, is that the budget should be based on an educational plan. And then we should look at what we need to expend and the revenues that are needed. Very often we tilt the triangle so that its base is revenues rather than the plan. And sometimes we have to do that. Certainly We all recognize that in the economy we're in, it is difficult at times to base our budget strictly on a plan. But do know that the best way to present your budget, the best way to build your budget is based on a plan that has been put together, usually by a strategic planning, but it could be any number of planning initiatives. So you're going to use your budget, obviously, for financial purposes, but there are other purposes of budgeting that allows you to give information. It's an opportune time to talk to the public about things that are occurring. So it does project the plan. You can certainly use the opportunity to show the plan for the district, the educational plan. You can speak about it in your presentation. It gives you an opportunity to tell the audience, and I would recommend that you always look at the fiscal environment in which your budget is operating in. And certainly, especially in these times when we have fiscal difficulties in the state and in the country, I think it's important that you lay that foundation so that people understand what you based your budget on or how you began to, the premise you used to build your budget. And so it gives you an opportunity to talk about the fiscal environment. It shows the allocation of the funds. It will certainly demonstrate and show, and you will have an opportunity to talk about certain funds and who's responsible for those funds. And it talks about any new initiatives. Maybe you're going to start a pre-K program or a full-day kindergarten or any number of programs that allows you to get the good things that you plan on doing in your school district out there for public knowledge. It certainly allows you to compare and evaluate school services from one year to the next so that you can say, this year we did this, and next year we plan on doing the same or something different. But it gives you that opportunity. It shows and provides planning, control, and expenditure of funds. That's something that it does to help you manage the budget as a school business official. It shows you what amounts have been approved by the public and the board, and it keeps the amounts within that budgetary constraint. And then it goes on to demonstrate the relationship of federal, state, and local support. We know that the largest of the three, obviously state and local, federal usually is smaller, but nonetheless, it shows the public where the support for the budget is coming from. We've talked about the need for planning, and certainly that, again, as I wanted to show this to you, there is this long-term perspective that feeds into the annual budget. You cannot neglect the long-term aspect. It is very difficult, especially, again, in today's fiscal climate, it is very difficult to try to develop an annual budget without looking long-term at what the implications are for the long term. So it is recommended by the Government Finance Officers Association. Most schools use strategic planning. There is a webinar that is available through New York State ASBO on planning. If you need to review and look at that, that is available out there on the website through New York State ASBO. The strategic planning initiatives, this just talks about, again, the aspects that you need to make sure are covered in your strategic planning before you begin your budgeting process. And if you don't have a strategic plan, may I encourage you to think about going through a process, maybe not a strategic planning process, but some sort of process involving stakeholders where there's discussion about your beliefs and missions and the analysis of your school district before you begin putting numbers to a piece of paper. Make sure that that you have given the public an opportunity to at least look at some of the objectives and action plans and put it in regards to the planning that has been going on in your school district, and even if you haven't done a formal strategic plan, I think you can certainly find an opportunity to talk to the public and give them an opportunity for input, maybe at the beginning of a board meeting. I think it's important. I think it's expected in most communities and by the public that they will have a say or an understanding about what is happening in their school districts. And so I would encourage you to think about that and see if that makes sense to you, and go forward if you feel it is beneficial to you. Now we're going to talk about some of the specifics as we get into some of the budgeting aspects. The budget calendar obviously is a very important first beginning. You need to look at and develop a budget calendar. Some of the discussion around the budget calendar, it comes from the law, so some of the wording is not exactly user-friendly all the time. But what I've tried to do on this is make it as concise as possible. Again, as I've said before, all of this information is available to you on various websites, and hopefully all I've tried to do here is synthesize it, bring it together in one spot for you, maybe to make it easier, or if nothing more, to let you know that these things are available. And if you have an interest, you can certainly look into them and develop your interest further as much as you want to. So we talked about the legal notice 4 times within 7 weeks, the first at least 45 days before the vote. The vote always has to be on the 3rd Tuesday in May. The budget notice that we talked about, that is a required mailing, has to be out there no later than 6 days before the vote. You must have a budget hearing, which is not earlier than 14 and not later than 7 days. Again, this is the legal jargon that you need to understand. The budget statement is a requirement. This is, again, the document sometimes known as the popular budget, which must be available 7 days before the budget hearing and at least 14 days before the vote. And then the property tax report card, which is due 24 days prior to the vote. I have not included everything in this slide that you would have to be concerned about, especially if you are the district clerk also. You want to make sure that you have knowledge about the propositions and the time frame and absentee ballots and those things. But since we're talking about budgeting, I tried to isolate this just to budgeting aspects. Please know there are dates that certainly may have an impact on your school district, probably will. So you need to look into this and make sure that you've covered all the bases for your school district. Now, I just wanted to again give you this information that if any of the dates that you come up with for your budget calendar should fall on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, then you go to the next business day. And that's according to the New York State General Construction Law, which is usually the law that kicks in for any sort of times when any of the dates might fall on a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. Now, again, I put down as the last bullet there the disclaimer, but please contact your school attorney with any questions. This is my opinion or my read of what is supposed to happen, and again, I think it's on solid basis. I certainly know of others that are following through with this, but again, you please contact your school attorney if you have any questions about what that date should be. But typically, according to the construction law, if there is any holiday or weekend dates, you would go to the next business day. Now, the budget statement that we discussed must include the 3-part format. Again, it's for presentation purposes only. It is not necessarily used to manage the finances, but for any presentation you're making about the budget, you need to have the three-part format. You also need to include in this budget statement a copy of the property tax report card. Along with that, the school academic report card has to be affixed to this document, to this budget statement. You also need the district fiscal accountability summary. I'm going to show you many of these in just a minute. And the salary disclosure notice, the administrative disclosure, salary disclosure needs to be included. And the newest document that has to be included is the tax exemption report, which is new in 2008. So all of these bullets represent documents that most often are affixed together to make the budget statement. And the budget statement then is, with all this information, is available to the public so that it can be distributed if they ask for it. Now, you've probably seen this chart, and it's a simple chart to show you where certain line items from your line item budget would go as far as the three-part component. So in this case, the Board of Education is part of the administrative component. Very often it's pretty cut and dry, except for the legal services, and then it can become a little bit different, because if it's a legal service that pertains to, as an example, negotiations or contract negotiations, that's considered an administrative task, and so it'd be under the administrative component. If you have the services of an attorney for program purposes, then or for a special education hearing, then that would be considered part of the program. So by and large, most of your line items will be nicely placed in one of the three, but oftentimes there are gray areas where you may have to make some judgment calls. Another area is in the area of the school supervision. Sometimes school districts will include the cost of the principal's office in administrative, other times in program. I think it depends mostly on how you are organized. Some principals are very involved in the day-to-day programmatic aspect of the school. Others are strictly supervisors, or more inclined to be supervisors than program type. So it depends on your school district as to where you would classify your school principals. I've included here in the presentation the actual language from the law as to what makes up the administrative program and the capital component, so that you have that readily available at your disposal. Again, you can read the what it says and make your own judgments. This reading, along with the chart, the previous chart, should help you to make the decisions fairly easy. Again, on program, it's usually instructional and all of those aspects that have to do with instruction, but don't forget the transportation expenses are included also in the program piece. And then the capital component is probably the lengthiest, the most wordy that you need to deal with. And it talks about some of the maintenance and operations and debt and those sort of items, and it's on 2 pages here. And also about service contracts, repair of school facilities. So the slides are there for you to look at. Hopefully they'll be helpful to you. Again, they're readily available other places. But you need to convert your line item budget into into these 3 component parts. So you need to take a close look at that and make sure you have done that. because that's the way your budget needs to be presented. Now, the property tax report card looks at various aspects of the appropriations and compares it to the previous year, and it must be submitted no later than 24 days prior to the statewide voting day. And it now includes also information about fund balance, and so you need to make sure that you have filled this out completely with all the information, uploaded it to the state education department, and included it as one of the documents in your budget statement. And it looks something like this. This is a property tax report card. It's a copy of what was printed off the SAM's system. You'll notice that the spending, the budgeted amount from the current budget to the prior year, and the percentage changes there. Again, this is uploaded to the state education department. It becomes a public document so that anybody can go out and look at this prior to the budget vote. Now the last section, as you'll notice, includes information on budget, on the fund balance. And so you need to fill this out carefully, accurately, because it has a lot of information that the public has readily available. And again, the property tax report card, a copy of that has to be included with the budget statement. The salary disclosure, which is also included with your budget statement, is a document that, again, is uploaded through the SAM system to the state education department. And it becomes a public document where it is readily available for the public to look at. So again, you need to make sure this is completed on a very accurately. And it's, again, you include anybody with the word superintendent in their title, assistant superintendent, associate superintendent, deputy superintendent, and any other administrator who is earning over $118,000. Again, remember that's $118,000 for this current school year. It may change before the budget is completed, so you want to keep an eye out on the state education department website to see if that number changes. And we've looked at that. There's also information out there, and this slide will help you. It defines what is meant by salaries, fringe benefits, and other compensation, which has to all be included on the administrative compensation. Sometimes the other category raises some questions. This gives you some examples of employer expenses for insurance, housing, moving, personal use of vehicles, residents, professional organizations, and other expenses. So I've included this for you as easy reference when you complete your administrative compensation report, which again is part of your budget statement and gets uploaded to the state education department. And then the fiscal accountability, along with the school report card. This is a document that, again, will not be out there. The new one is not available yet. It is through the New York State Education Department website that you can find the fiscal accountability, but it is this document. It's actually a two-page document. I've only shown you the first page, but it is a two-page document, and again, this gets attached to your budget statement and is available should the public ask you for a copy of your budget. And then the next requirement for the budget statement is the newest requirement, which is the exemption reporting by taxing jurisdiction. It shows all the properties that are exempt from taxation in your school district, and it needs, again, to be completed. Usually your assessor can do most of this for you, but it needs to be completed and, again, attached to become part of your budget statement, which is available for public use if they ask for it. And this is a sample right from the New York State Department of Real Property Tax Service. It shows you the exemption classification, a brief description, and then the amounts are there. So, again, this is a sample. Your district may have pages and pages, or it may be 1 or 2 pages. But you need to complete this and have it attached to your budget statement. We talked about the school budget notice, which must be completed. It can be, again, it must be mailed to the public. It can be mailed separately, or it can be part of a budget brochure if you complete one. Typically, it's on a page by itself, last page. It has to be out there so that the public can see it. It compares information, and with the school information from year to year, but it also provides here a contingency budget amount. So you have to calculate a contingency budget, even hopefully you won't be on one, but you need to at least show the public what the implications of that or what the amount would be so that the public can make a judgment as to your school budget versus the contingency. So this document, again, needs to be completed. It needs to be sent to the public. It can be sent by way of a budget brochure if you so choose. We looked at some other definitions, but again, the document itself and this encompasses many of the aspects we've talked about, but it shows the anticipated revenues and expenditures, along with it compares past information and relates the fiscal elements to the mission. So in this, we see not only the basics of budgeting, but also this is taking a look at and saying that we need to look at long-term planning, and we need to look at how we are marketing our budget, all the aspects that we have discussed in this webinar. And as we look at the document and try to define the document, we also want to look at the process and try to define what that is. And it's a sequence of activities involved in planning the programs, estimating the expenditures and revenue, gaining approval, and using the budget to manage. Everything that we've covered in the webinar is summarized, I think, in this statement, because we have looked at the expenditures, and we have looked at gaining approval, we have looked at marketing, and we have looked at managing that budget once it's in place. Most of the time, school districts are using a line item budget. That's probably, most of the software that's out there will produce line item budgets, although with the way that the uniform system of accounts is set up for school districts, you certainly have an opportunity to take that line item budget and make it into a program budget by using 4 digits at the end as a suffix. And so there is that opportunity, but most of the time what is required to be given to the State Education Department at year end is a financial ST3 report is the line item budget, and that's what most districts are using. You can have a program budget, and again, there are certain specific types of program budgeting. You probably have heard some say that they use a zero-based budget, but they don't base their new budget on what has occurred in the previous year. And that's well and good, and if that's their approach. Sometimes what they really mean, though, is not necessarily zero-based, but they take the base from where the approved budget is down to a lower level. In other words, there's always an assumption that you have to pay debt. To get to zero on debt isn't really going to occur, because so zero base in some cases, as it may commonly be discussed, or people may say they're using zero-based, is probably not zero as such, but a certain bottom line level upon which they will build a budget, which is, it's just a question of how they're defining that. But I know, and you've probably read too, that some say they use a zero base. Really, zero base is based on alternative levels of funding, often used in the federal government, and then the most effective approach is usually selected. There's performance-based. I think at some point school districts will get more involved in performance-based budgeting, trying to link performance with spending. I think we're seeing some of that come through in Race to the Top funds. I think that if you're involved in the Contract for Excellence, there's an attempt to try to link spending and performance. So I think that's probably coming down the turnpike for many school districts. The site-based or participative budgeting is a building-level, bottoms-up approach, which, again, is an approach which has gained a lot of favor over the years. It probably makes more sense to have people closer to the spending and needs of students to be very involved in a budgeting process. And so I think if you're not using site-based in a pure sense of the word, you might want to at least get somewhat involved in involving those folks who are teachers and principals who are very close to the spending of the funds for educating students. And then the last one is perpetual budgeting, or sometimes called continuous budgeting. Really, I think that's probably what most schools are involved with. Once you have new information, you add it to your budget. You have a month of actual information. You drop the budget month and add the actual, and it just continually is a budgeting process where 1 month gets dropped, another actual gets added, and it just seems like there's a continuing process that occurs, and really budgeting never stops. It is always being looked at. The line item budget, most widely used, it doesn't highlight programs as such. It doesn't really try to equate performance and spending. Looks at usually 1 year, and it doesn't typically easily connect strategic or capital plans to the budgeting process. Again, if you use software, I believe most of the software that's out there now, you could take your line item budget and certainly try to make it into a program, more program-like budget, which might be helpful. The equation, just remember, again, your appropriations have to equal estimated revenue. The comptroller wants to find a structurally balanced budget. If anybody wants to look at your budget, and what that means is that the budget finances recurring expenditures with recurring revenues. And the comptroller usually does not speak highly of one-shot, non-recurring revenues. If the financing salaries of employees, usually you want to make sure you're doing that by way of state aid or local tax levy, and not by fund balance, because that is a recurring type of expenditure. And again, to be structurally balanced, to meet that definition, you should be financing it with recurring revenues. As you go to project your expenditures for this year, you're going to have some challenges, as always. And again, these are just some highlights or cautions that I would throw out there for you, that if you have salaries in place, you know that if you have contracts in place, I should say, and you know the amount of that contract, then you can quite easily, usually, calculate what your salaries will be. If you don't have contracts in place, then you're going to have to make some educated guesses as to what to include in your budget for next year, because you want to have enough to cover any of the arrangements or agreements that may occur by way of the negotiations. So it even gets more difficult in this fiscal climate to try to estimate what that may be than it has in the past. So again, that will be a challenge if you don't have contracts in place. Substitutes, never really can predict what your substitute cost would be. It's based on how many of your teachers may be absent, and so it's difficult to try to understand what that may be. Fringe benefits, certain fringe benefits fall as a percentage of your salaries, such as Social Security, but others do not. And like health care, if you're self-funded, you obviously are paying based on the number of claims, and sometimes that can be difficult to estimate. We know, and we've seen information already, that pension costs will go up dramatically for next year. We're looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 33 to 40% increase in the rate that is on each of the retirement systems. And so it will be a huge challenge to incorporate that in next year's budget. You need to look at your enrollments if you are increasing. Again, the cohort survival methodology, there is a discussion out there on the website at the New York State Education Department if you're not familiar with that method, but that is the methodology that's typically accepted by the State Education Department, and so you need to be concerned about any enrollment increases or decreases in your budgeting process. Your supplies will usually follow your enrollments. You need to be aware of any of the supplies like textbooks that also may be aided, and you need to make sure that there is an agreement or that the amount that you're using as a textbook amount for purchases coincides with the amount that you will be getting back in aid. And the debt, typically the amortization of your debt is fairly straightforward if you've already issued debt. If you're in the process of a building project and you haven't issued debt, but you may issue debt in the ensuing school year and may have to make a payment on that, then that's a little more difficult to decide what the rate would be that you would use. Usually you want to err on the side of being somewhat conservative, I believe. Again, it's difficult, I know, in this fiscal climate to be too conservative, but you want to make sure you have adequate appropriations to cover expenditures. Utilities, I would encourage you to look at the U.S. Department of Energy website. They have some projections out there that won't leave you to try to come up with your own projection, at least as far as what the information they have. I think it's better to look at the expert advice that's out there and try to use that as much as you can. If you have contracts that are locked in, at least you can come up with an idea as to what the cost per unit for your electricity and natural gas or oil may be, but sometimes you don't have that. And so the U.S. Department of Energy does have a website, and you can obtain information from that that'll help you. Another challenge is always special education and trying to determine what students may move into your district in the future, because that can have a huge impact. And then the last one, and I'm sure there are others, is the equipment cost. And you want to try to define the equipment with the highest threshold that you can, because if you go to contingency, most of your equipment has to come out of your contingency budget, except for a couple of exceptions. So the higher your threshold for equipment, the more you can consider your items that you're purchasing to be supplied, and therefore the more flexibility you would have if you were to get to a contingency budget. And then when you project your revenues, is going to be a huge challenge this year. We've heard some initial comments, I'm sure you have, from Governor-to-be Cuomo about his thoughts and on state aid. But we do know that the ERA funding most likely won't be there, and the governor-elect is looking to certainly bring the state finances into some sort of understanding, or bring it to where it is acceptable to the public. And so it's going to be a huge challenge to try to determine what that aid may be. If you look at the New York State Department of Budget website, there are some projections out there as to what they are thinking that the state aid will be. That doesn't mean that's what it's going to end up to be, but it might be a starting point for you to see, for instance, that the expenditure-based aid is going up X% according to the Department of Budget. It may give you some help to try to understand what that number may be until we actually see the governor's proposal in the next couple of months. So you need to do the best you can. Certainly, I think we all agree state aid is not going to be flowing in huge amounts or increases for the next school year. Property taxes, with the housing market slowdown, I would be very careful. Property taxes are probably going to be somewhat stagnant in a lot of areas where there's been foreclosures, and there's been, obviously, because of the economy, a lot of grievances on assessments, and so this could have a major impact on your tax rate. And you may do everything you can to keep your levy at a saleable amount, keep your budget in line, but when you get to actually looking at those items that may affect the rate, and you don't have control over that. So I would encourage you to look at the rate, an estimate of the rate, as you go through the process, just so it doesn't sneak up on you. And again, I think if you're conservative early on in the process, it'll serve you well. And then the local revenues, you need to try to estimate interest revenues, which obviously has declined and probably won't change appreciably for the next school year. But again, the revenues are going to be an equally engaging challenge as expenditures will be also. Now, the fund balance, a very important part of the process in budgeting, and this is from the New York State Education Department Handbook, talks about that it is the school business official that typically provides that forecast. And you need to try to begin that process as early as possible. You can, I'm sure you know, you can retain an unappropriated amount up to 4% of next year's budget, and anything over and above that that's not reserved, you must use to reduce the tax levy. The fund balance is very important because it can be used to, as we say, give back to the taxpayers to reduce the tax levy. If it's used appropriately and you planned how to use it, then it can mitigate some of the current problems that we're looking at and can help to keep the tax rate in line. It certainly, by having fund balance, it improves your credit rating. If you are issuing bonds and you ask Moody's to take a look at your financial situation, they will be very interested in what you're doing with fund balance, and it will have an impact on your credit rate. It is certainly a tool for long-range financial planning, as we've talked about. It will help you to smooth out any of the volatility that we can't predict, like the reduction in state aid that we've seen based on the medical percentages from the federal government that the state thought they would receive, but apparently will not receive, and so we've seen our state aid after the fact now being reduced. And also it will help you to do, as we talked about, an environmental scan to look at the weaknesses and the opportunities and the threats to your school district, and it will help to try to smooth out some of those issues if those are issues that you're having in your district. Now, the fund balance is typically broken into three main areas. The reserved and two main areas, the reserved and unreserved, and then the unreserved is further shown as appropriated or unappropriated, and the maximum unappropriated that you can keep is 4% of next year's budget, and that's according to the real property tax law, 1318. I think I've mentioned in other webinars that the terminology reserved, unreserved, appropriated, and unappropriated may be changing according to the GASB. There is new terminology that's being looked at, but it hasn't changed at this point, and so I've used the current terminology that has been used for a number of years. The total fund balance, unreserved plus the reserve, you should begin your projection, because if there is any excess that needs to be appropriated, you need to plan to use that for your budgeting purposes, and you should at least begin that no later than January. Some districts, some business officials are constantly trying to estimate what their fund balance will be, just as they are continuously looking at budget items, they're continuously looking at the fund balance. It will help you to prevent the swings in tax rate that we've talked about, the spikes that can occur. It will, if you have a situation in your fund balance where you do incur a deficit situation, you will then need to probably increase taxes, and you will also need special legislation to help you out of that situation. If you were to get into that situation, again, you need to consult with the state education department, consult with your school attorney, and but know that very often when that occurs, legislation is required, and the subsequent year requires somewhat of a hefty tax increase to get out of the deficit situation. And if you, and we're going to look at some reserves as we finish up here. As you come, the reserves can be helpful if you use the correct reserves. Some of them are more flexible than others, and so you need to look at those and make sure that if you are using reserve accounts, you've given the Board of Education adequate flexibility. Now, the workers' comp, again, these are here for your use. They're readily available elsewhere. I'm not going to read them all to you, but is a very flexible type of account, a reserve account, where there are the board can set it up and the board can fund it. Same with the unemployment reserve account. It is available for the board to set up and to fund and to move money fairly readily. The repair reserve has a few more restrictions. Again, to spend anything out of that, you do need to have a public hearing. Capital reserve is probably the most restrictive, and that needs a voter approval to set it up, to fund it, and to use it. So it takes a lot of effort to use a capital reserve. Insurance reserve is, again, one of those flexible type of reserves. There is a limitation of 5% that can be put into that of the annual budget. There is no limit of the total amount that can be put in there, but you're limited on a given year to 5%. Property loss and liability, the reserve may not exceed 3% of the annual budget, or $15,000, whichever is greater. So there is a restriction on the amount. However, it is somewhat flexible. Debt service would be for special purposes. It wouldn't be something that every school district would be using. It would be, again, for a specific purpose of paying off debt, and so it doesn't have the flexibility. The tax reduction, if you sell a building, you can put the proceeds in this reserve, and you can use a little bit of it each year to help write down the tax levy. The tax certiorari would be for any court cases that are available. Typically, your independent auditor will make sure that you can back up the amount in this reserve by at least outstanding court cases. And the retirement contribution reserve is available for the employee's retirement system and not the teacher's retirement system. And this reserve has had some questions. I know there was a question at our last webinar. Let me just say to you, or encourage you, to talk with your auditor, your independent auditor, about this reserve if you need to use it. I think the confusion or questions arise because, first of all, it's fairly new, within the last 7 or 8 years, but also it has to do with the difference between accrual and modified accrual accounting and what that definition is. So it's beyond the scope of certainly what we can speak of today, but again, I would encourage you, if you have questions on this, to consult with your independent auditor. The employee benefit, accrued liability, reserve funds for the payment of employee benefits upon termination of service. This has received some discussion from the comptroller. It is not as flexible as some of the other ones, so you need to use that with caution. That's the budget notice. I put this slide up there, the budget vote history, because, again, I wanted to show you that for the most part, school business officials, school districts are doing something right to get this kind of passage percentage, so that speaking about revotes and contingency doesn't seem to be all that applicable to many, and hopefully won't be. But I put some information in here for your use so that you can look at it. If the proposed budget is defeated, then what your options are. You can put it back up at the same amount or at a different amount, or you can adopt a contingency budget. And the timelines for doing that I have included, again, just to have it readily available for your use. There, I believe, will be some issues, and we've talked about some of this as we've gone along, but obviously the economy and the situation the economy is in will be one of the main issues that you'll have to deal with in the upcoming budget season. Stabilization funds are gone, and if you've heard, I know that Governor-elect Cuomo is talking about some sort of a mid-year state aid cut. And it's interesting because it was Governor-elect Cuomo's father, Mario Cuomo, who actually in 1990 enacted the unprecedented state aid mid-year cuts. And that was under, as I have here, Cuomo 1. And so now if Cuomo 2 may be involved in doing the same. But the first time it ever occurred in the history of the state was in 1990 under Cuomo. But we may be faced with that again. It's a possibility. The other thing, the tax caps that, again, the governor-elect is discussing, it may be in the neighborhood of 2.2%, toward 4%. It may look similar to what we are now facing under contingency budget caps, but it'll be a cap on the levy rather than on the appropriations as we have now. But again, all of those issues are out there, and we just have to wait to see how they come out. The contingency budget laws are defined in the education law in these three sections, and there are special rules if you're under contingency for transferring funds. Again, this is just in there as a reminder to you. If you get in that situation, if you're on a contingency budget, you must eliminate certain items, certain expenditures, and I've listed those there, certain salary items, certain equipment equipment based for enrollment. If you have an influx of students, do not have to be taken out. And you have to make a distinction with pupil supplies versus teacher supplies, and your pupil supplies would have to be come out of your contingency budget. The dollar cap on that is 120% of CPI or 4%. In the current school year, it was at 0, and it looks like inflation, or as measured by the CPI, won't be negative or 0 for this school year, but it will be a positive amount. So we'll be looking at 120% of something, most likely, and it probably won't get to 4%, though. And remember that with contingency, you not only have to meet the dollar cap, but you also have to meet the administrative budget cap, which looks at your administrative expenditures of the prior year budget or the last defeated budget and compares it to the budget that you're putting out there in the current school year. So, again, know that that's there. If you get to the point of contingency, you probably need to study it and look at it in some detail to make sure you're doing it correctly. This is the contingency budget cap worksheet that's out there on the website. You can usually follow it pretty closely, and if you get to the point, of course, you have to calculate it for the budget notice. Please know that on one aspect under the contingency budget, they have where you can put in extra funds for enrollment. If you anticipate enrollment increase, be very careful about the amount that you use or put in there because, again, there is guidance on the website about how to calculate that amount if you're in a situation where you have enrollment increases. So, again, follow the format, follow the formula here, and it's really pretty self-explanatory if you follow that format, and just be aware of some of the issues with enrollment, which is if you're not careful, you can put a lot of money in there that may not be acceptable if someone wanted to question it. And as I talked about the contingency cap, the numbers I've seen, it looks like we do have some inflation this year, not that will be used for next year's budget and contingency cap. We're not in a deflation mode, and so there should be something greater than 0 for calculating contingency. These are some of the contingent expenses. It's governed by, obviously, the Board of Education. The formal opinion of council back from 1967 is still the best source of information. Again, that's available. I've summarized some of the information here, along with giving you some summaries of what the non-contingent expenses are. And then I've also included at the end here some of the items that you can look at and study if your district is in a situation where you need to reduce your budget. Again, it's difficult in a webinar to discuss these, not knowing your particular situation, but I put some ideas out here that hopefully if you get to that point, you will be able to look at these and use this to your advantage. And then the last thing that I want to mention is on the supplemental appropriations, that if for any reason the state aid comes in at a later time than after the budget has been voted on, there is guidance out there that you want to be careful of, that you follow, about incurring or setting up additional expenditures, supplemental appropriations after the vote. And if that were to occur, again, I would encourage you, this is some guidance that you can look at early on, but you also would want to consult with State Education Department and also probably your school attorney to make sure that you're following the what the State Education Department has suggested. So that is our webinar. I'm going to turn it back to Matthew, and thank you for being so attentive.
Thank you very much, Mike. If anyone has any questions, please begin typing them into the chat now. Mike, it looks like we do have couple questions here from G. Kachuk. Our principals receive quote-unquote target pay for meeting their building goals, test scores, attendance, etc. Does that count as compensation?
Ask that, does that count as compensation, and what was the nature of it again?
The principals receive quote-unquote target pay for meeting their building goals, meaning test scores, attendance, etc. And they wanted to know if that counts as compensation.
Well, it sounds to me from what the description is that it would be considered compensation. Is that in regard to reporting it for some purpose? Is that why that question is asked?
Is what they wrote.
I think the safe answer is that it does sound like it's considered compensation.
Okay, and we have another question from Karen Johnson. Since the budget notice has to go out after the budget hearing, it cannot go as part of the budget newsletter if the newsletter goes out before the hearing. Is that correct?
The newsletter typically will already be ready to be mailed, and this is one of the problems with the hearing date, the way it is set up. So there's really no way to get that newsletter out on time and hold the budget hearing and have the budget hearing make any difference on the levy. So oftentimes what is suggested is that a district will give the public an opportunity to speak to them other than the public hearing, because just the way the law is, the public hearing comes too late to make any difference as far as the levy.
Okay, thank you very much, Mike. This time we don't have any more questions, so I'd like to thank you all for attending the Basic Budgeting and the Budgeting webinar series. I will be sending out copies of the presentation and a link to the video file after the webinar. Once again, thank you very much. Hope you all have a good day.
This conference has not started or has been paused by the moderator. You'll be placed on music hold until the conference begins.